Constance Whitfield Lund was 77 years old when her children divided the estate. Nobody invited her into the room. She sat outside on the back step of an old tool shed while they split the house, the savings account, 41 years of a life built together. She could hear the papers turning through the half-open kitchen window. A chair scraped the floor. Nobody came to get her. When her youngest son came to the door, he read from a list. 3.8 acres of sloped ground, an old tool shed. 60 days. He folded the paper. He looked at her once. He went back inside. The door closed. Not hard, just closed. She was holding her dead husband's notebook, brown leather, worn at the corners. He'd asked her to take it before anyone else could. She hadn't opened it. In 40 years of marriage, Everett had never once walked past that ground without slowing down. He always slowed down here. The will was read on a Tuesday. Constance Whitfield Lund was not in the room. She hadn't been asked to leave. Nobody had said, "Go wait outside, Mom. We'll come get you when it's done." It was simpler than that, and somehow worse. They had started talking, and she had not been where the talking was, and no one had noticed the difference. She sat on the back step of the old tool shed, the one Everett had built the year Garrett was born, the one nobody had painted since, and listened to the sounds coming through the half-open kitchen window. Papers turning. A chair pushed back. Renee's voice, then the attorney's, then silence, then Garrett asking something she couldn't make out. Her daughter-in-law's heels on the kitchen tile. 2 sentences she didn't catch. A drawer opening for no reason she could understand. 41 years in that house. She knew every sound it made. She was wearing Everett's flannel shirt, the dark green one, frayed at both cuffs, too big across the shoulders. She hadn't planned it. It was just the shirt she'd reached for at 5 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, and she hadn't thought to change. The morning air in Aldervale in December carried the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just settles. She had Georgia dirt under her fingernails. From the last morning she and Everett had worked the back garden together. 3 weeks before the hospital, 6 weeks before the end. She had washed her hands after. She'd washed them a dozen times since. It was still there, in the lines of her knuckles, in the half-moons beneath each nail. She had stopped trying to get it out. When Garrett came to the door, he was holding a folded sheet of paper. He stood in the doorway, not on the step with her, in the doorway, and read from it without looking up more than once. The house and the 12-acre farm, split 3 equal ways between the children. The savings account, $34,000, divided equally. The equipment and the truck to Garrett. And for Constance, 3.8 acres of sloped ground behind the property line, the old tool shed, and a 60-day right of temporary residence in the main house while arrangements were made. He folded the paper. He looked at her. 1 second, maybe less. Then he went back inside. The door closed. Not hard, just closed. She sat with it for a moment. The sound of it. The specific sound of a door that has been closed by someone who has already puffed on to the next thing. She knew about elective share rights. She'd read about them in a magazine in the hospital waiting room during one of Everett's longer appointments. The kind of afternoon when you read anything just to keep your hands busy. Oregon law. A surviving spouse could refuse the will, claim a statutory share. She had understood it well enough. She had decided, sitting in that waiting room with the magazine open in her lap, that she would not do that. Not until she understood why Everett had done what he'd done. He had never done anything without a reason. She looked up. The east side of the back lot ran along the fence line, 3.8 acres of sloped red ground that the previous owners had left unworked for 20 years before Everett bought the property. Useless, her son had called it once, years ago when she'd asked what Everett was doing out there on weekends. That back lot is useless, Mom. Dad just likes to poke around. She counted the wooden stakes along the east row without meaning to. It was the kind of thing you did when your mind needed something small to hold on to. 47. Spaced exactly 6 feet apart. The wood had gone gray with weather, but the stakes were solid, driven deep, not the work of an afternoon. Someone had put them there carefully, over a long time, with a specific distance in mind. She looked at her hands again. The Georgia dirt in the lines of her knuckles. The notebook in her lap. Brown leather, worn at the corners, taken from the pocket of Everett's work jacket an hour ago before Garrett had come to lock the tool shed for inventory. Everett had asked her, the morning he left for the hospital the last time, standing at the back door with his bag already in the truck. The notebook in the tool shed. Don't let anyone take it before you do. She had taken it. She hadn't opened it. Everett Lund had spent 40 years reading land for a living. He had read it the way other men read weather, not looking for what was visible but for what the visible things were pointing toward. The broken ground behind the Aldervale farm, the ground they had handed her like an item checked off a list, was the darkest red she had ever seen him stand still in front of. He had always slowed down here. Constance Whitfield grew up in Macon, Georgia, in a house where the front porch faced east and her father never explained anything. He just pointed. He would crouch down in the peach rose after a rain and press 2 fingers into the red clay and hold them there a moment, and she would crouch beside him and press her own fingers in and try to feel what he was feeling. She was 5, then 6, then 9. He never told her what she was supposed to notice. He just waited until she noticed it herself. The way the clay held its shape when the drainage was good. The way it smeared when it didn't. Which weeds came up in the low spots and why. By the time she was 12, she could walk a row and tell you where the water was sitting underground just by watching what grew above it. Her father called it listening. Not looking. Listening. The ground talks, he said once, the only time she could remember him saying it out loud. Most people just aren't paying attention. She paid attention. She was the youngest of 4, the one who stayed closest to the work, the one her mother called steady, and her sisters called serious, and her father called, when he called her anything at all, sensible. It was not a warm word the way he said it. It was something closer to respect. She went to school on a scholarship she applied for herself, studied education because she liked children, and because teaching was one of the few things a woman in Macon in the mid-1960s could do with a degree that didn't require someone else's permission. She got her certificate at 21 and spent the next 6 years in a second-grade classroom on the east side of town, where she taught 22 children per year to read and to sit still and to raise their hands before they spoke, with mixed results on all 3 counts. She saved money the way her father had taught her to tend soil, slowly, without rushing it, putting back more than she took out. 6 years of teaching. $23,000, every bill deliberate, transferred to a joint account when she married without conditions or conversation. It was hers. Then it was theirs. That was how she understood things worked. Everett Lund arrived in Macon in the spring of 1973 on a federal geological survey contract. 2 years, the southeastern states, mapping what was underneath the ground that everyone was busy building on top of. He was 30 years old and from Portland, Oregon, 3rd-generation Norwegian on his father's side, with large hands and the particular kind of patience that comes from spending years in the field waiting for the earth to tell you something. He walked into her classroom on a Thursday afternoon in April, after the children had gone home, and asked if she knew the way to the county land records office. She was grading papers. She told him without looking up, 2 lefts and a right, can't miss the sign. He came back the next day. He had found the records office fine, he said, but he had a question about the property maps from the 1940s and thought she might know who to ask. She didn't. She told him so without looking up. He came back the following Thursday. This time he stood in the doorway for a moment before he said anything. She looked up. Still lost? She said. He considered this. Looking for something else, he said. She went back to her papers, but she left at 4 o'clock instead of 5:30, which was not something she did on Thursdays. They married in March of 1974, in the First Methodist Church of Macon, Georgia, with 60 people in the pews, and her mother crying from the second row, and her father sitting beside her mother with his hands on his knees and his face doing the thing it did when he was satisfied but didn't plan to say so. Everett wore a suit that fit him well enough. Connie wore a dress her mother had helped her alter. The photographs came out slightly dark because her uncle was operating the camera, and her uncle had always thought he was better at things than he was. They lived in Georgia for 4 more years, while Everett finished out his federal contract and began consulting work. Diane was born in 1976, in the same hospital where Connie had been born. They left for Oregon in the spring of 1978, when the consulting work had settled enough to make the move make sense. She packed 2 suitcases and her mother's cast-iron skillet. On the drive north, 2 days in Everett's truck, Diane asleep in the back, the country changing from red clay to high desert to green. He said something she remembered for a long time afterward, not because it was remarkable when he said it, but because of what it turned out to mean. "I have a piece of land in Yamhill County," he said. "I don't quite know what to do with it alone." She looked out the window at the passing scrub. "What color is the soil?" He didn't answer right away. That was Everett. He took questions seriously enough to think before he answered. "Darkest red I've ever seen," he said finally. "Almost the color of Georgia clay after a long rain," she said. He glanced at her. "Yeah, like that." "My daddy used to say," Connie said, "that dark red soil is soil that's holding something, waiting to be asked the right question." He didn't say anything for a while after that. He just drove. But his hands on the wheel changed, the set of them, the way they relaxed a fraction, the way a man's hand changed when someone has just said the thing he'd been carrying around without quite knowing how to put it down. When they passed through Yamhill County for the first time, late on the second day, Everett slowed the truck near a gravel turnoff without any sign. He didn't pull in. He just slowed, the way her father used to slow when they walked past a row that was asking to be looked at, and looked out the window at the slope of red ground behind a weathered fence line. Then he drove on. She noticed. She didn't ask. She had learned, somewhere between the peach rows and the second-grade classroom, that some things answered themselves if you gave them enough time. Everett was one of those things. She packed 2 suitcases and her mother's cast-iron skillet, and she drove northwest with a man who talked about soil the way other men talked about God. The Aldervale farm was 16 acres of good Oregon land, and for 31 years it was enough. Not dramatic enough, not photograph-worthy enough, not the kind of enough that people talk about at dinner tables. Just enough in the way that good land is enough. It fed what needed feeding, held what needed holding, asked for work, and returned it with interest if you were paying attention. Everett was away most weeks. Federal consulting work took him into the field Monday through Friday. Soil surveys, geological assessments, properties all over the Pacific Northwest that someone needed mapped before something was built on top of them. He came home Friday evenings with mud on his boots and the particular quietness of a man who had been thinking hard all week and hadn't finished yet. Connie had the farm, the garden, the 3 children, and a part-time position at the elementary school in town 2 mornings a week, which she kept not because they needed the money, but because 22 years in a classroom had made her the kind of person who needed children nearby to feel like herself. The back lot sat behind the main property line, 3.8 acres of sloped red ground the previous owners had left unworked and called worthless in the sale documents. It was separated from the rest of the farm by an old wooden fence that leaned in the direction of the prevailing wind. Nobody used it. Nobody talked about it. Everett had bought it in 1986, separately, with money from his own consulting account before they had fully merged their finances. He paid cash. He didn't explain why. She didn't ask. He had a way of acquiring things quietly. Tools, books, odd parcels of information about places he'd surveyed. And she had learned early that asking too soon was the same as asking the wrong question. In 1988, he started going out there on weekends, not to build anything, not to clear it. He would take his sampling kit and his notebooks and spend 3 or 4 hours walking the slope, digging small test holes, writing things down. He came in for lunch and went back out. Connie watched him through the kitchen window sometimes and thought he looked the way her father had looked when something in the peach rose wasn't adding up, present and elsewhere at the same time. She asked him once, "What are you doing back there?" "Listening to it," he said. She didn't ask again. That was how he worked with things that mattered. You didn't interrupt the listening. 3 things happened over the years that she filed away without thinking much about them at the time. The first was in 1994, when she found a stack of viticulture textbooks on his desk: soil science, vine propagation, the geology of the Willamette Valley wine country. She moved them to make room for the mail and set them back. He ordered all kinds of technical books. It didn't mean anything particular. The second was in 1997. Diane was home for the first time in a year, still carrying a library book she hadn't returned, and she wandered out to the back fence one afternoon and called in to ask what her father was doing out in the lot. Everett was standing near the east row with his compass, the way he stood when he was calculating something. "Paying back a debt," he said. Diane came back inside and poured herself a glass of water and didn't say anything else about it. But she remembered. Connie saw her face when he said it, the small pause, the quick look, and filed that away too, without knowing why. The third was a Saturday in 1999, early November. Connie was at the kitchen window refilling her coffee when she noticed Everett standing at the far end of the east slope in the rain. Not moving. Compass in hand, facing east, the way he sometimes stood in the field when he was waiting for something to confirm itself. She watched him for 20 minutes. He didn't move the whole time. She poured her coffee and went back to the table. Some work required weather. She had understood that since she was 9 years old, crouching in the peach rows while her father waited for the clay to show him what it was doing. That was the life. 16 acres and a back lot and a man who came home on Fridays and went quiet the same way the land went quiet in winter. Not empty, just holding. Then 1991 happened, and the life bent around it, and they went on. It was a former colleague from his Federal Survey days, a man Everett had worked alongside for 3 years in the late 1970s, someone he trusted the way you trust the people who have been in bad weather with you. The man had a small mineral extraction project in southern Oregon. He needed a partner who understood the geology and could read the assessments. Everett read them. He thought it was sound. He put in $23,000 without telling Connie because he was certain, and certainty had always felt to him like a reason to move first and explain later. The project failed in 8 months. Not because anyone was crooked. The geology was right, but the market wasn't. And there's nothing in an assessment that tells you what a ton of ore will be worth 2 years out. The partner lost money too. There was no one to blame, which was the part that was hardest to carry. You can be angry at someone who cheated you. $23,000. Every dollar of it was money Connie had saved in 6 years of teaching second grade in Macon, Georgia. Money she had transferred to their joint account when they married, without conditions, without keeping track of whose it was. She had never mentioned it again. It had become simply theirs. She found out on a Tuesday in March, looking for a utility bill in the desk drawer. The bank statement was underneath it. She read it twice, slowly, the way she read things she needed to understand completely. Then she put it back exactly where she had found it, in the same position, the same fold. That night, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The dinner things were cleared. The children were in their rooms. Everett stood in the doorway and didn't say anything because he didn't know yet what she knew, and she could feel him trying to read her the way he read land, looking for what the surface was pointing toward. She didn't look up. She wasn't ready to have the conversation. She wasn't sure she was going to have it at all. In the morning, she put on her boots and went out to the garden the same as always. He watched her from the kitchen window. She didn't know that until years later, when she read it in one of his notebooks. Not the back lot notebooks, a different one he kept for other things. He had written about that morning in a way that was not an apology and not an explanation. He had written it the way you write something you need to remember exactly. She went out to the garden, he had written. Same boots, same time. I don't know what I did to deserve that, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worth it. From that spring on, every weekend he wasn't in the field for work. He was in the back lot. Not hiding, not punishing himself. Building something slowly, the way you build things when you know they have to last. Some debts you can't pay back with money, so you pay them back with 30 years of work on a piece of broken ground nobody else wanted. Everett died on a Thursday in November, and the family attorney came the following Tuesday with a manila envelope and a voice trained to deliver difficult news without inflection. But that came later. First, there were 6 weeks. 6 weeks in the cardiac unit at Providence Newburgh, where the hallways smelled of floor cleaner and the overhead lights ran on a cycle that made it impossible to tell morning from mid-afternoon. Connie was there every day. She brought his reading glasses because he kept forgetting them, and a thermos of coffee because the hospital's was undrinkable, and on the 3rd week, one of his notebooks, not the back lot notebooks, one of the older ones, because he asked for something to write in, and she didn't want to bring the wrong one. He wrote in it every day after that. She didn't ask what. He didn't say. The morning he was transferred for the final time, he stood at the back door of the house with his bag already in her car and looked out at the property the way he sometimes looked at a survey site before he left it, taking a last reading, making sure he hadn't missed anything. Then he turned to her. "The notebook in the tool shed," he said. "Don't let anyone take it before you do." She nodded. He got in the car. She went to the tool shed the next morning and found his work jacket on the hook by the door, the one he'd worn every weekend for 20 years, the elbows worn through and the left pocket weighted down with the notebook he'd placed there. She took the jacket off the hook and held it for a moment, the smell of it, lanolin and soil and something that was just him. And then she took the notebook from the pocket and put the jacket back. She didn't open the notebook. The funeral was a Wednesday. Fewer people than she had expected, and more than her sons had planned for. And she noticed both of those things at the same time from the front pew, without being able to explain why either one mattered. Former colleagues from his federal survey years came, men and women in their 70s with the particular posture of people who had spent decades outdoors. A professor from Oregon State arrived with wildflowers wrapped in newspaper. Not florist flowers, actual wildflowers, the kind Everett would have been able to name without looking them up. Old neighbors from the early Aldervale years. The daughter of a man he'd done survey work for in the 1990s, coming on her father's behalf because her father was in a memory care facility and couldn't come himself. Garrett and Renee stood together near the door. Diane stood slightly apart from them, the way she sometimes stood at family gatherings, present but not quite in the group, as if she were listening for something the rest of them weren't. Connie shook hands and accepted embraces and said thank you for coming to each person who came to her, which was everyone, because everyone came to her first. She held the notebook the whole time, tucked under her left arm. Nobody asked about it. The attorney came 2 weeks later. Connie sat in the corner armchair, the one by the east window, the one she had read in every evening for 30 years, the one that still held the shape of her. She set the notebook in her lap, below the line of sight of anyone in the room, and kept her hands on top of it while the attorney opened his envelope and began. The main house and the 12-acre farm, divided equally among the 3 children. The savings account, $34,000, split 3 equal ways, $11,333 each. The farm equipment and the truck to Garrett, as the one who would be managing the property. And for Constance, the 3.8 acres of sloped ground behind the property line, the old tool shed, and a 60-day right of temporary residence in the main house while she made arrangements. The attorney finished and looked around the room. Garrett glanced at Renee. It was a quick glance, the kind that carries a whole conversation. Well, that's that. And Renee received it the same way, with a small nod before she looked at her phone and then back up. Diane looked at no one. She was looking at the east window, at the gray November light coming through it, with the expression she wore when she was thinking about something she wasn't going to pat to yet. Connie sat with her hands on the notebook and did not move. She had read, in a magazine in the hospital waiting room during one of Everett's longer appointments, about elective share rights in Oregon. A surviving spouse could refuse the terms of a will and claim a statutory portion of the estate instead. She had understood it well enough. She had folded the magazine and put it back in the rack and thought, not until I understand why he did it this way. Everett had never done anything without a reason. Whatever this was, there was a reason. After the attorney left, the 3 children stayed in the living room. Connie heard their voices start up before she had reached the kitchen. She didn't stop. She went through the kitchen and out the back door and sat down on the step of the old tool shed. The same step she had sat on while they were inside with the attorney. The same step she had sat on the day Garrett read from his list. Through the half-open kitchen window, she could hear them. Garrett's voice first. The back lot is useless. Sloped, no irrigation, no road access. It's fine for Mom. She likes it out there anyway. Then Renee. The 60 days is the problem. Where does she go after that? Garrett. I can clear out the north storage room. It has heat and a bathroom. She'd have her own space, she wouldn't be underfoot. Then Diane, flat and even. That land can't be sold. Dad filed a conservation registration on it last year. A pause. Garrett. So it's worth even less. Diane said nothing after that. Connie heard her pull out a chair and sit down, and then the conversation moved to other things. The equipment inventory, the timeline for the property transfer, whether the north field fence needed replacing before spring. Connie sat on the step and looked out at the back lot. The soil was dark after 2 days of rain. The 47 stakes along the east row were barely visible in the low light, just their tops showing above the cover of dead grass. She counted them anyway, the way you count things when your mind needs something simple to do. 47. 6 feet apart. Same as always. She thought about what Diane had said. Dad filed a conservation registration. Not we should look into this, or I wonder what that means. Just the fact, stated plainly, and then nothing else. The way you state something you already know. The morning before Garrett locked the tool shed for inventory, Connie went in early. She took Everett's work jacket from the hook. The notebook was gone from the pocket. She had that already. And she took his compass from the shelf above the workbench and the 21 remaining notebooks stacked on the lower shelf. She put them all in the canvas bag she used for the farmer's market and carried it out to the back lot. Garrett came to the tool shed door an hour later and found her gone. "What did you take, Mom?" She was already past the fence line. "Everett's things," she said, and kept walking. Behind her, the Aldervale farmhouse sat in the gray morning light. 12 acres of good Oregon land, a house she had lived in for 31 years, a kitchen garden she had planted and replanted every spring since 1981. She didn't look back at it. Not because she wasn't sad. She was. But sadness and stopped are not the same thing, and she had known that since she was 9 years old, crouching in the peach rows beside her father while he waited for the clay to show him what it was holding. The back lot was waiting. The notebook was in her bag. And Everett had never once put anything down in writing that wasn't worth reading. The tool shed was larger than she remembered. Everett had never invited anyone inside. Now she understood why. The main space was what she'd expected. Workbench along the south wall, tools hung on pegboard, shelving units with labeled bins for hardware, a chest freezer from the 1990s that hummed to itself in the corner. But the east end was different. Someone had framed in a sleeping area at some point. A single bed built from 2x4s, a thin mattress covered in ticking, a wool blanket folded at the foot in the way of someone who folds blankets out of habit rather than expectation. A small window above the bed faced east. A bare bulb on a wire hung from the ceiling joist, connected to the same line that powered the workbench light. Nobody had known this was here. She was certain of that. If Garrett had known, he would have mentioned it when he was dividing things up. If Renee had known, she would have had an opinion about it. Connie set the 22 notebooks on the work table in order. She didn't know the order yet, so she lined them up by number, 1 through 22, the way you lay out something you intend to read carefully. She stood and looked at them for a moment. Then she took notebook 22 from the end of the row, the last one, the one from his jacket pocket. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. The handwriting on the first page was smaller than she expected, compressed, the letters close together, the way his writing got when he was thinking faster than his hand could keep up. She had seen it in grocery lists and field notes and the margins of books. She knew it as well as she knew his voice. Cloverdale, March 1988. Soil behind the lot is dark red after rain. Took samples today. Waiting for results. She read it once. Then she closed the notebook and set it on the blanket beside her. Not because she didn't want to read more. Because sitting alone in a tool shed in December reading a dead man's handwriting by the light of a bare bulb was more than she was ready for at that moment. She needed daylight. She needed to stand on the land first and let it be real before she let the words be real. She lay down on the narrow bed with her coat still on and slept better than she had in 6 weeks. In the morning, she put on Everett's work gloves. They fit. Not perfectly. His hands had been broader across the knuckles, the fingers slightly longer, but close enough that she didn't have to think about them once they were on. She noticed this and didn't say anything about it to anyone because there was no one to say anything to, which was its own kind of freedom. She walked the back lot from the fence line to the far edge and back, every foot of it, for 7 days, not looking for anything specific. Just looking the way her father had taught her to look. Slowly, without deciding ahead of time what she expected to find. The slope ran roughly north to south, steepest at the east end, where the ground dropped toward the tree line. The soil was consistent throughout, that dark red that had no name she knew, that stayed darker than the surrounding earth for hours after rain, that seemed to pull light down into it rather than reflect it back. What she didn't find was what she would have expected on unworked ground. Thistle, blackberry, the invasive grasses that colonized every neglected field in Yamhill County. There were some, at the edges near the fence line where seed drift came in from the neighboring properties. But the main body of the slope was something else. Low-growing plants she didn't know the names of. Ground cover that spread in patterns. A vine-like growth along the east row that she crouched beside for a long time without being able to identify. Her father had told her once, crouching beside her in the peach rows, pressing 2 fingers into clay, that good soil didn't stay bare. It always found something to grow. The question was whether you knew how to read what it grew. She didn't know how to read this. Not yet. On the 4th day, she found a rusted metal stake driven into the ground near the south fence, different from the wooden ones. Older, the kind surveyors used to mark boundary points. She photographed it with her phone and kept walking. On the 6th day, she found a second one, 30 feet from the first, at a slightly different angle. She photographed that too. On the 7th day, she stopped at the east corner, the steepest part of the slope, and counted the wooden stakes again. 47. Exactly 6 feet apart. The wood had gone silver gray with weather, the tops of them barely above the dead cover grass. She pulled one out of the ground and looked at it. Hardwood, not pine. Cut on a mill, not split. Pointed at the bottom with a few angled cuts. The kind you made when you wanted something to drive deep and stay. She pushed it back into the hole and packed the dirt around it with her boot heel. Somebody had put these here with a specific distance in mind. 6 feet was not a random measurement. She went back to the tool shed and stood in front of the notebooks. 22 of them. She picked up number 7, the middle of the run, 1997, printed on the spine in his small handwriting, and opened it somewhere in the middle. April 1997. Drove test stakes east row. Soil retaining moisture better than expected after dry winter. If summer results confirm, will extend to north row next year. Connie asked last night what I was doing out here. I said, listening to it. That's true. I just didn't say that it started answering. She read it once, then again, then a third time, standing at the work table with the notebook open in front of her. Then she took it outside and sat down on the ground at the east row, her back against the fence post, notebook in her lap. The soil was cold through her jeans. The sky above the tree line was the flat white of a Pacific Northwest winter afternoon, the kind that gives you light without warmth. Somewhere in the back of the neighboring property, a dog was barking at something it would never catch. She sat there for a long time. It started answering. 27 years ago, he had written that. 27 years of weekends on this slope, in this soil, with these stakes and these notebooks, and whatever it was the soil had been saying back to him. She had been in the kitchen. She had been in the garden. She had been 30 feet away for 27 years. She knew, sitting there in the cold with Notebook 7 in her lap, that she was going to need help reading it. She sat down on the cold ground right where she was, holding Notebook 7, and did not get up for a long time. The dirt was dark red beneath her, the same color it had always been. She just hadn't known until now what that meant. On the 11th morning, a woman appeared at the north fence line carrying a shovel and no explanation. Silver hair cut short, rubber boots to the knee, canvas work jacket with the collar up against the fog. She wasn't young and she wasn't tentative. She stood at the fence and looked at the slope the way people look at things they already have opinions about. "I saw you measuring the ground," she said. Not a greeting, an observation. Connie was pulling dead growth from the east row. She straightened up. "I wasn't measuring. I was counting." "Same thing," the woman said. "I did it for 20 years for the government." She looked at the dark red soil where Connie had been working, and something in her face changed. Not surprise, more like confirmation. "I'm Sylvia Crane. I moved into the Reardon place last month. Constance Lund." Connie pulled off one glove. "My husband was a geologist. He left 22 notebooks about this land. I don't understand everything he wrote." Sylvia looked at the soil again. One beat of silence, the kind that meant she was thinking rather than not listening. "I'd like to see those notebooks," she said. They started the next morning, at the work table, with coffee Connie made on the camp stove and notebook number 1 open between them. Sylvia read the way Connie's father had worked soil, without rushing, without deciding ahead of time what she expected to find. She would read a section, set the notebook down, go outside and look at something, come back. She asked questions that assumed Connie knew the answers, which meant Connie had to figure out if she did. On the first day, Sylvia picked up a handful of the dark red soil from the east slope and squeezed it in her fist. She opened her hand and looked at what it did, the way it held its shape, the way the edges crumbled. "Basalt," she said. "Ancient volcanic. When lava cools over millions of years and breaks down, this is what you get. Iron-rich, mineral-dense, drains fast, but holds what it needs to hold." She let the dirt fall back to the ground. "The top Pinot Noir wineries in Yamhill County are running out of this. They've been running out of it for 15 years. It's what makes the difference between a wine that's good and a wine that tastes like it came from somewhere specific." Connie looked at the soil she had been walking on for 31 years. "He knew that," she said. "He knew it in 1988, Sylvia said, before most of the winemakers knew it themselves. On the third day, Sylvia found Notebook 9. She read the relevant section twice without saying anything, then closed it and carried it out to the south fence. Connie followed. Sylvia walked along the fence line until she found the row, south-facing, 12-degree slope, the aspect Everett had noted in his 1999 entry as optimal for what he was testing. 12 vines, 25 years old. Connie had seen them every day for a week and had registered them as overgrown scrub, something to deal with later, something the previous owners had planted and abandoned. She had not looked at them properly. She looked at them now. The trunks were dark and twisted, thicker than she expected. The bark gone silver gray with age. They were shoulder height. Not the thin whips she associated with young vines, but something established. Something that had spent 2 decades sending roots down into that basalt soil and deciding to stay. The leaves were gone for winter, but the structure was there, the wood heavy and permanent. "He planted these in 1999, Sylvia said, reading from Notebook 9. Dijon 115 clone, From Sunridge Nurseries in California. They've been supplying burgundy clones to Pacific Northwest growers since the 80s. South-facing row, 12-degree slope. She looked up at the vines, then back at the notebook. He chose the aspect. He sourced the right clone. He planted them in the right year. She paused. He wasn't making a farm. He was running a proof of concept. A proof of what? That this soil could grow them. Sylvia closed the notebook. He didn't need a harvest. He needed the vines to survive long enough to demonstrate the terroir. And they did. She looked at the 12 vines standing in the gray December light. 25 years. Nobody pruned them properly. Nobody harvested them. They're still here. Connie put her hand on the nearest trunk. The bark was rough and cold. He came out here every weekend, she said. For 30 years. I know, Sylvia said. I read it. On the 5th day, Sylvia found notebook 18. She read for a long time without speaking. When she set it down, she didn't say anything immediately. She picked up her coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. He contacted a patent specialist in Portland in 2014, she said finally. Agricultural heritage varietal documentation, 22 years of soil research, microclimate data, varietal trials. He had enough to support a formal application. She set the cup down. I spent 20 years working in agricultural patent assessment for the federal government. The documentation he put together in these notebooks, by himself on weekends, with equipment he bought out of his own pocket, is better than half the applications I reviewed in my career. Connie didn't say anything. I mean that, Sylvia said. I'm not being kind. I'm telling you what it is. On the 7th day, they found notebook 21. Sylvia read the last 3 pages slowly. Then she turned the notebook around and set it on the table so Connie could read the final entry. Willow Creek Winery, Dundee. Discussed informally. Long-term cultivation lease. $24,000 per year base, plus 12% revenue from heritage varietal line after patent certification. Terms favorable. Representative willing to wait for formal application process. And then, below that, in the smaller handwriting he used when he was writing something for himself rather than for the record. Not signing. Waiting for Connie to read this. Connie read it twice. Then she sat down. The kerosene lamp was between them on the work table, throwing light up at an angle that made the shadows on the ceiling move when anyone breathed. Outside, the fog had come back in. The valley was quiet. He knew they'd divide things the way they did, Connie said. Not a question. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. From notebook 15 onward, every decision he made has a note beside it. When the time comes. Every assessment, every contact, every conversation with the winery, all of it has that note. She folded her hands on the table. He didn't leave this land to you because there was nothing else to leave. He left it because it was the one thing he was certain your children wouldn't understand enough to fight for. Connie looked at the number on the page. $24,000. She looked at Everett's work gloves on the wall hook. The ones she wore every morning now. The ones that had fit her hands well enough from the first day. In 1991, she said, he lost $23,000. Money I'd saved teaching school for 6 years. He signed a paper without telling me, and the project failed and the money was gone. She looked at the notebook. He never explained it. He never really apologized. The next morning I went out to the garden and that was that. Sylvia waited. The lease offer is $24,000 a year. Sylvia said nothing. She looked at the notebook and then at the gloves on the wall and then at her hands on the table. Some things don't need a response. The silence was the response. He hadn't made the decision for her. He had made it possible for her to decide. She hadn't known, until that moment, how different those two things were. Connie closed notebook 21. She looked at the row of notebooks on the shelf, all 22 of them, in order, 36 years of weekends. "I'm going to need a lawyer," she said. "I know one," Sylvia said. "Her name is Renata Osei. She's in Salem. She handles agricultural land, and she doesn't waste words." A pause. "You'll get along." Outside, the dark red ground held 36 years of quiet work. Inside, the kerosene lamp threw two shadows on the toolshed wall. And Constance Lund finally understood what her husband had been listening for all those years. 3 weeks after she moved into the toolshed, Garrett called. His voice was too even. "How are you, Mom? We've been thinking about you." She was at the work table with notebook 11 open in front of her. She closed it. "I'm fine. What do you need, Garrett?" Not a question. He heard the difference. "I'm going through the farm paperwork," he said. "Just wanted to make sure you were keeping track of the timeline." "The 60 days, I'm keeping track." A pause. The kind that had something behind it. "There's someone coming to look at the North Field next week. A buyer. I wanted to give you notice so you could plan accordingly." She didn't say anything for a moment. Outside the toolshed window, Sylvia was walking the east row, hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the ground, the way she looked at things she was calculating. "Is that all?" Connie said. "Mom, I just—" "Thank you for calling, Garrett." She set the phone down. Sylvia came in from outside 10 minutes later, boots wet from the grass. She looked at Connie's face and didn't ask. She poured herself coffee and sat down at the other end of the table and waited. "We need the attorney," Connie said. "Now, not later." Sylvia nodded. "I'll call Renata in the morning." Renata Osei arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in a dark blue car that was practical rather than impressive, which Connie noted and appreciated. She was 54, compact, with the particular quality of someone who had stopped wasting energy on anything that wasn't the matter at hand. Probably sometime in her 30s, by the look of it. Her office was in Salem, but she came to them. She set her bag on the work table, accepted the coffee Connie offered, and looked around the tool shed with the brief, assessing look of someone who was already forming opinions. She reviewed everything in order: the will, the conservation easement documentation, the relevant sections of notebooks 18 and 21, the informal proposal from Willow Creek Winery. She read without comment, made occasional notes in a small notebook she'd brought, and asked 2 questions. When the conservation easement had been filed, and whether Connie had been present when it was filed. And no. Renata wrote something down. Then she set her pen on the table. "The will is clean," she said. "The transfer of the back lot to you is straightforward. There's no basis for contesting the transfer itself. The conservation easement blocks subdivision and construction, but Section 7, Paragraph 3 explicitly permits sustainable agricultural cultivation, including commercial leasing arrangements." She paused. "Your husband read the statute before he filed." He read it carefully. Connie looked at the stack of notebooks on the shelf. 36 years of weekends. "What will my son do when he finds out the land has value?" Renata considered this. "Not long. He'll challenge the will. Specifically, he'll argue testamentary capacity, that your husband wasn't fully competent when he made certain decisions, including filing the conservation easement in 2022. He'll suggest the decisions didn't reflect Everett's genuine intentions. Connie said nothing. It will be a mistake, Renata said. Your husband documented everything he did and why he did it in his own handwriting across 22 notebooks covering 36 years. A man who wasn't competent doesn't produce that. She picked up her pen again. When you're ready, I'd like to start the formal process for the winery lease, and I'd like a copy of the conservation easement registration. When Garrett finds out, he'll find out when we file, Renata said. That's soon enough. Garrett found out before they filed. He came on a Saturday morning without calling. His truck on the road outside. His footsteps on the gravel path. His knock on the open tool shed door that was more announcement than question. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Renata's briefcase on the table, the geological maps spread out beside the notebooks, the three women seated in a configuration that was clearly not a casual gathering. His face went through something. Not anger, not yet. More like recognition that the situation had moved further than he'd understood. What is this? He looked at the maps, at the notebooks, at a woman he didn't know sitting across from his mother with a notepad. Come in, Connie said. This is Renata Osei. She's an attorney. Garrett's jaw tightened. He came in. He stood rather than sat. This is conservation land, he said, his voice back to the careful evenness she'd heard on the phone. You can't run a commercial operation on protected land. Whatever you're planning here, Mom, it's not going to work. Renata didn't look up from the paper she was writing on. Conservation easements under Oregon statute prohibit subdivision, construction, and extractive use. They explicitly permit sustainable agricultural cultivation, including commercial cultivation leases. She slid a printed page across the table toward him without lifting her eyes. Section 7, Paragraph 3. Your father read it before he filed the registration in 2022. Garrett picked up the page. He read it. His expression didn't change in any way that was easy to read, which told Connie he was controlling it. He set the page down and looked at her. Mom, you don't understand what you're getting into. This woman, he glanced at Sylvia, showed up 6 weeks ago. You don't know anything about her. And now there's an attorney and... You're right, Connie said. He stopped. I didn't understand, she said. For 30 years, I watched your father go out to this ground every weekend, and I didn't ask what he was doing because I trusted that he was doing something worth doing. And I was right about that. She looked at her son directly, the way she hadn't since the day of the will reading. What I didn't understand was that he spent those 30 years making sure I'd be all right when he was gone. I understand it now. Garrett didn't say anything. The even tone was gone, and whatever was underneath it was harder to look at. The attorney stays, Connie said. The lease goes forward. You're welcome to come back and see what we're building here. The door is always open. But the decisions are mine to make. He left. He didn't slam the door. He closed it the same way doors get closed when someone is trying not to show how they feel. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived from his attorney. Testamentary capacity challenge. The argument was that Everett had not been fully competent in 2022 when he had filed the conservation easement, and that the filing should therefore be reviewed. Garrett had learned about the winery lease when Renata filed the formal paperwork. After it was already signed, after the cultivation team had already been scheduled, there was nothing left to block. So he went after what he could. Renata called that evening. They don't have the evidence to support it. But the process takes time. A pause. Do you want to proceed? Connie was on the tool shed step. The east row stakes were just visible in the last of the light. 47 of them, 6 feet apart, put there by a man who had known exactly what he was doing. He spent 30 years on this, she said. I can spend a few months. She set the phone down and looked at the darkening ground. The same dark red it had always been, still holding whatever it had always been holding, waiting for someone to ask the right question. She went back inside. The notebooks were waiting. Diane came alone on a Friday afternoon, without calling ahead, the way she used to come home from college when something was wrong. Connie heard the car on the gravel and recognized it without looking up. She was in the East Row, working through the wild apple trees that had grown up between the vine stakes over the years. Small trees, untended, the kind that appear when ground is left alone long enough. She'd been meaning to prune them for 2 weeks. She was doing it now. Diane didn't come into the row. She sat on the tool shed step and set her bag beside her and looked at her mother's back. I need to talk to you, Mom. I'm listening. Connie made a cut, moved to the next branch. Diane was quiet for a moment, not gathering herself. She had gathered herself in the car on the way here. This was something else. The particular quiet of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say and is now deciding whether the rehearsed version is the right one. Dad called me, she said, in September, 6 weeks before he went to the hospital. Connie's hands didn't stop. He called on a Tuesday evening, Diane said. You were at the grocery store. He told me about the land, the notebooks, the winery proposal, the conservation easement, what it blocked and what it permitted. She paused. He told me everything. Then he asked me a question. Diane looked at her hands in her lap. He asked if I thought you were strong enough to handle this alone. Connie made another cut. I asked him why he was asking me that. He said, because I won't be there, and I need to know who will be. Diane stopped. I told him you were stronger than all of us put together. He said he knew. He said he needed to hear me say it. The pruning shears opened and closed. A branch fell. He asked me not to tell anyone, Diane said. Not Garrett, not Renee, not you, not until after the will was settled. He said if Garrett knew before, he'd act before. He knew how Garrett operates. He said the only way this worked was if you found it yourself. Silence. The valley was still. Somewhere below the tree line, a hawk was making slow circles over the neighboring field. I drove home after the call and sat in my car for 45 minutes before I went inside. Diane's voice was even, not flat, even, the way you speak when you've decided that the only way to say something clearly is to say it without adding anything to it. I knew what he was asking me to carry. I said yes. For 3 months, Connie said. Not a question. 6 weeks while he was still alive. 2 months after. Connie stopped pruning. She stood with her back to Diane, looking at the apple tree, at the cut she'd just made and the ones that still needed making. You knew since September, she said, and you didn't tell me. Dad didn't want me to. I'm not asking about Dad. Connie turned around. Diane looked at her mother straight on. She didn't look away, and she didn't offer anything to soften it. I thought he was right, she said. He knew Garrett. He knew that if you knew, Garrett would find out. And if Garrett found out before the will was settled, he would have moved to contest it then. The land would have been in dispute before you ever set foot on it. She paused. And I thought, I still think, that Dad was right that you needed to find it yourself, not be told about it. Find it. You didn't think I had the right to know before he died. Diane was quiet for a moment. Not long, but real. I thought Dad was right, she said again. And I also thought he might be wrong. I've been living with both of those for 3 months. I'm still living with them. The silence between them was not angry. It was the kind of silence that happens when something true has been said and there's nothing immediately useful to add to it. Connie looked at her daughter. The set of her jaw, the way she was holding her hands in her lap, the particular stillness of someone who is not asking for anything, not even understanding, just trying to be present for whatever came next. Diane was uncomfortable. She had been uncomfortable since September, and she was still uncomfortable now, and she wasn't pretending otherwise. Connie turned back to the apple tree. She found the next branch that needed cutting. A crossing branch. The kind that rubbed against its neighbors and would eventually damage both if left. She positioned the shears, made the cut. Clean, deliberate. Your father knew people very well, she said. Diane quietly. He knew you best. Connie moved to the next tree. Her hands kept working. The afternoon light was coming in low across the slope, the kind of light that makes the dark red soil look almost warm, almost like Georgia clay after a long rain. She didn't say that she forgave Diane. She didn't say that she didn't. What she did was keep working and let Diane sit on the step and watch and not ask her to leave. That was what she had. Connie turned back to the apple tree and made one more cut. Clean, deliberate. The kind of cut that helps something grow. The court dismissed Garrett's claim on a Wednesday in July. Renata called to say so. Connie said thank you and went back to watering the seedlings. She had started them in March, a tray of cover crop seedlings she was testing along the north edge of the lot, a variety Sylvia had recommended for basalt soil management. They were small still, 2 inches maybe, but they were establishing. She could tell by the color of the leaves. She finished the row and set the watering can down and stood for a moment looking at the tray. 2 months of a legal process, and now it was over, and she felt not relieved exactly, more like right. The way things feel when they go the way they were always going to go if you just stayed with them long enough. She picked up the watering can and started the next row. Garrett called 2 weeks later. It was evening, the light going low and warm across the slope, and she was on the tool shed step reading when the phone rang. His voice was different. The careful evenness was gone. What was underneath it was harder to name. Tired mostly, and something quieter than tired. You won, Mom. She set the book down. I didn't win anything. I kept what your father left me. If we'd known the value of the land, your father knew. Not loud, just clear. He knew in 1988 when he bought those first soil samples in. He knew in 1991 when he decided what he owed and how he was going to pay it. He knew exactly what each of you would choose if you understood what that ground was worth. That's why he didn't tell you. Silence on the line. I didn't know he'd done all that, Garrett said. His voice had gone smaller. Not weak. Just smaller. The way voices get when something has shifted and there's no going back to how it was before. I know, Connie said, but your father did. She looked out at the east row. The stakes were just visible in the low light. 47 of them, 6 feet apart, driven into the ground by a man who had known, for 36 years, exactly what he was doing and why. Another silence. Then Garrett, do you want us to come see you? She thought about the question for a moment. Not long. When you're ready, she said. Come here. Not the farm here. There's a trail from the highway pull-off, 20 minutes on foot. Ask for Benedict when you get there. He's the neighbor on the north side. He knows the property. He'll show you the way. Okay, Garrett said. I'm not going anywhere, Connie said. She hung up and sat with those words for a moment. That was new. That was everything. Renee called 3 days later, on a Saturday morning. Connie was in the garden when the phone rang. Not the back lot, the kitchen garden she'd started behind the tool shed, the one that was already producing more herbs than she could use. Mom, do you need anything? The question landed simply, the way Renee's questions usually did. Practical first, feeling underneath. I need you to know I'm not angry, Connie said. I just need you to stop thinking I don't know what I'm doing. A pause. I know you know, Renee said. I just didn't know Dad knew that much. He knew everything. Connie looked at the rosemary she'd planted in March, already knee-high, already going woody at the base the way rosemary did when it found soil it liked. He just wasn't good at saying it out loud. No, Renee said quietly. He wasn't. A small silence between them. Not uncomfortable. The kind that happens when two people are thinking the same thing at the same time, and neither one needs to say it. Then Renee, can I come visit? Bring your boots, Connie said. The ground is still wet this time of year. She hung up and stood in the doorway of the tool shed, looking at the dark red earth in the last of the afternoon light. It had always been this color. The same dark red through every season, through 31 years of living 30 feet away from it and not knowing what it was holding. She knew now. She knew the name of the soil and the age of the rock underneath it, and the names of the 12 vines on the south slope, and what they would produce when the patent came through and the first harvest was pressed. She knew what Everett had been listening for. It had always been this color. She just finally knew what it meant. In April, Constance Whitfield Lund signed a 15-year lease with a winery in Dundee. She used Everett's pen. She hadn't planned that. It was just the pen in her pocket. The signing happened at the winery's offices, a low building at the edge of their estate vineyard, with a view of the valley that on a clear day went all the way to the Coast Range. The representative, a woman named Claire, organized and precise, laid out the documents in order and walked through each page. Connie read everything before signing. Every page. Claire had clearly expected this to take 20 minutes. It took 45. $24,000 per year, base rate. 12% of revenue from the heritage varietal line once the patent was certified. Still 2 years out, possibly more. 15 years, renewable. The cultivation team would arrive twice weekly, Tuesdays and Thursdays. Connie signed the last page and capped the pen and put it back in her coat pocket. The drive back from Dundee took 20 minutes on the county road. She stopped at a stationery shop on the main street. The kind of small shop that sells cards and notebooks and things people give as gifts, and bought a notebook with a blue cover, the same size as Everett's, but different in every other way. Thicker paper, spiral binding, 2/3 of it still blank by the time she got back to the tool shed. She set it on the shelf next to notebook 22 and left it there. The cultivation team from Willow Creek arrived the following Tuesday. 3 people. Marcus, the lead, 34 years old, UC Davis trained, with the particular confidence of someone who has spent a decade being the expert in every room he walked into, and 2 others, quieter, who did the work while Marcus explained the work. He was good. Connie could see that from the first morning, the way he read the slope, the questions he asked about drainage, the care he took around the old vines. He knew what he was doing. By the end of the second week, she was pointing out things he hadn't noticed, not corrections, observations. The way the moisture held differently in the northeast corner after rain. a patch of ground cover near the south fence that didn't match the surrounding growth, which turned out to mark the location of an old drainage channel Everett had noted in Notebook 4. The angle of the afternoon light in October, which she'd been watching for 2 months, and which affected the east-facing slope in a way that hadn't made it into any of the formal assessments. Marcus listened. He wrote things down. By the 3rd week, he had stopped explaining things to her she already knew. Sylvia moved into the Reardon place permanently in May. Not temporarily, not as an extended visit. She brought the rest of her things from Portland in 2 trips in her old station wagon and put her name on the mailbox, and that was that. "You didn't have to do that," Connie said. "No," Sylvia agreed. "I didn't." She came by on Wednesdays, usually mid-morning, usually with something. A book she'd finished, a pruning tool she'd found at the hardware store, once a battery-powered radio she'd picked up at an estate sale. Connie put the radio on the tool shed windowsill and tuned it to the country station out of McMinnville. It played at 3 in the afternoon while she worked, and the sound of it, fiddle and steel guitar, voices that carried the particular weight of that tradition, sounded like Georgia in a way that didn't hurt, like something familiar that had followed her here and decided to stay. She finished reading all 22 notebooks in June. The last entry of Notebook 22 was on the final page, written in a hand she recognized as Everett's, but shakier than any entry before it. The handwriting of someone writing in a hospital bed. The letters still precise, but the line of them unsteady, like a road that knows where it's going but can't quite hold the center. Aldervale, October 2023. I don't know how much time is left, but I know enough to say this. That land will do what good land always does. Wait for the right person. Feed the right things. I just needed to make sure the right person got to stay with it. She read it twice. Then she closed the notebook and held it for a moment before placing it on the shelf with the other 21. All in order. 1 through 22. 36 years on a shelf in a tool shed that nobody had known existed until she moved into it. She had been the right person all along. She just hadn't known he knew. She took the blue notebook down from the shelf, opened it to the first page, wrote the date at the top. June, the month the rosemary in the kitchen garden had gone to flower, the month the cover crop seedlings had established enough that you could see the rows from the fence line. Then she stopped. That was enough for now. The page was mostly blank. She put the notebook back on the shelf and went to check the seedlings. Garrett came in September. He drove out alone, which was the first thing she noticed. No Fernanda. No strategy. Just Garrett. In new rubber boots that were clean in a way that made clear he had bought them for this and not worn them before. Benedict met him at the highway pull-off and walked him in along the trail. 20 minutes through second-growth timber, and then the fence line, and then the open slope of the back lot, red soil and vine stakes, and the old tool shed at the far end. Connie was at the east row when they came through the gate. She watched her son stop and look at the ground. Really look, the way she hadn't seen him look at anything in years. Then he saw the vines. He walked to the south row and stood in front of them and didn't say anything for a long time. How long did it take him? He said finally. Not a question with a rising inflection. More like something he was working out. He planted them in 1999. She came to stand beside him. You were 17. He looked at the twisted trunks, the silver bark, the way the old wood had thickened and set over 25 years into something that wasn't going anywhere. She watched him do the math. Garrett didn't say anything. He put his hand on the nearest trunk, the same trunk she had put her hand on the day Sylvia first brought her here. The bark rough and cool, the wood underneath solid in a way that 25 years had made inevitable. He stood there for a while. Then he walked the row, slowly, all the way to the end and back. Benedict waited near the fence. Connie went back to what she'd been doing. Before he left, Garrett stopped at the first vine. He bent down and picked up a dry branch from the ground beneath it. A small thing, a pruning drop from the previous winter, weathered and light. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it in the pocket of his jacket. He didn't explain it. She didn't ask. Some things between a mother and a son don't need words yet. They just need time, the way vines do. October came to Yamhill County the way it always does. Not suddenly, but the way something arrives that has been traveling toward you for a long time. The light changed first. Not the temperature, not the color of the leaves, the light. It came in lower and at a different angle, the way it does in October specifically. The way it makes the dark red soil look like it has a fire somewhere inside it. Connie had been watching this happen for a month, noting it in the blue notebook in the mornings when the east window caught it first, trying to find the right words for something that didn't need words so much as needed to be recorded. She woke at 6, and not because of the alarm. She hadn't set one since January, but because the light came through the east window at exactly that hour in October, and her body had learned to meet it. She lay for a moment listening to the early birds work through their shifts, then got up and started the coffee. The ritual had become specific in the way rituals do when there's time to let them. Water heated to just below boiling, not boiling. She'd learned the difference from Marcus, who'd learned it somewhere else and passed it on the way. People pass things on, when they're working alongside someone they've stopped underestimating. Beans ground by hand in the small grinder Sylvia had brought over in May. The cloth filter Sylvia had insisted on because paper filters, she said, stripped out the oils. Connie had thought this was a preference. It turned out to be true. She took the coffee to the table and opened the blue notebook. A third of it was filled now. Not journal entries, observations. Soil moisture after rain versus after dry weeks. The way the cover crop established differently in the northeast corner, which she now understood was related to the old drainage channel Everett had mapped in Notebook 4. Notes from Marcus's visits that she had verified or qualified in her own subsequent observations. The angle of afternoon light in October on the east-facing slope, which she had been tracking since September, and which she was fairly certain was going to prove significant when the second cultivation zone was formally assessed. It was a working document, the same kind Everett had kept. She hadn't quite noticed this yet. Outside, the land looked different than it had in December when she'd first walked it. Not dramatically different. The slope was the same slope. The basalt soil was the same soil. The 47 original stakes stood where they'd always stood. But the new stakes were in now, 30 of them extending the east row north, and the cover crop had established along the edges in the way Sylvia had said it would, and the 12 old vines on the south slope had been properly pruned for the first time in their lives. Marcus had done the pruning in February. Connie had watched every cut, not to check his work. She'd known after the first month that his work didn't need checking. She'd watched because she wanted to understand. She'd asked questions after each cut. Why this branch and not that one? What the vine was being asked to do for the next season. How you read 25 years of growth to find the line the vine had been trying to make all along. Marcus had answered each question with the seriousness it deserved. By the end of the second day, he was asking her questions back. The first intentional harvest would be next year. Small. They were managing for quality, not volume, and the vines had been producing without guidance for too long to rush them now. But next year, Renata had sent a note in August. The varietal patent was in its third stage of review. Estimated 2 more years, possibly less if the documentation held up, which Renata's note implied it would. Connie had written the update in the blue notebook with the same handwriting she used for soil moisture readings. 2 more years. The vines had waited 25. 2 years was nothing. That morning, Sylvia came by at 9 with her compass and walked the new East Row extension, measuring angles. "This row gets better afternoon light than I expected," she said when she came back. "Everett knew," Connie said. "It's in Notebook 8. He measured it in 2003 and noted it as a reason to extend north when the time came." Sylvia looked at her. "You've read all 22. Finished in June. Now I'm reading them again from the start." Connie set down her coffee. "I understand more this time." Sylvia didn't say anything to that. She just nodded in the way of someone for whom this required no commentary. Renee had come in September, a Saturday, with her 2 children, the 14-year-old and the 11-year-old, who Connie knew mostly from photographs and 2 Christmases and a birthday party 3 years ago, when everything had still been organized around the house on the Upper West Side. They came down the trail with Benedict, who had taken to meeting visitors at the pull-off without being asked. The way people in rural places take on small, necessary functions and make them their own. The 14-year-old had headphones around her neck and looked at the slope with the careful neutrality of a teenager preserving the option to be interested or not interested, depending on how things went. The 11-year-old had no such strategy. He went straight to the East Row and crouched down and picked up a handful of the dark red soil, held it in both hands, squeezed it slowly, the way you do when you're trying to feel what something is rather than just identify it. Connie saw it. She looked away for a moment, at the vines, at nothing in particular, at the specific quality of September light on the slope. When she looked back, the boy was still crouching, still holding the soil, turning it over in his hands. She didn't say anything. Some things you let happen without naming them. Renee stood beside her and asked about the weather and about the contract and about whether the tool shed was warm enough in winter. And Connie answered each question honestly and without ceremony. The conversation was practical and kind and a little careful, the way conversations are when 2 people are navigating back toward each other from opposite ends of something they don't entirely agree on. It was enough. It was what they had right now, and right now was what mattered. When they left, the 11-year-old looked back at the slope one more time from the gate. Then he followed his mother and sister down the trail. The afternoon of the day she wrote it, Connie was alone. Sylvia had gone home at noon. Marcus and his team didn't come on Saturdays. Benedict had stopped by in the morning and left before lunch. The valley had gone to that particular afternoon stillness of October, when the light is doing everything and the air has nothing to prove. She took the blue notebook and went to sit on the tool shed step. It was the same step, the same rotting board on the right side that she'd been meaning to replace since January. The same view, the slope, the vine rows, the line of old oaks along the north fence that had been there longer than anyone alive could remember. But her hands held something different now. Not Everett's notebook, still unread, still carrying whatever it was going to say. Her own, her pen, her October. The light across the valley was the specific gold that only October makes. Not summer's direct heat, not winter's gray erasure, but something in between that knows what it is and doesn't apologize for being temporary. She opened the blue notebook to a new page, looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote, October, Aldervale, soil after last night's rain, darkest red of the year. She stopped, read what she'd written, read it again. She got up and went inside to the shelf, took down notebook number 1. The first one, the oldest, the cover worn at every corner from 36 years of handling. She opened it to the first page. March 1988. The handwriting was younger, steadier, faster. The hand of a man in his 40s who wrote quickly because there was always more to record than there was time to record it. The town name at the top was Cloverdale, not Aldervale, the name the county had used before the incorporation, before the renaming, before any of the things that had happened in the intervening years. The land hadn't changed its name. Only the maps had. Cloverdale, March 1988. Soil behind the lot is dark red after rain. She read it twice. Then she looked at what she had written in the blue notebook. October, Aldervale, soil after last night's rain. Darkest red of the year. She hadn't known she was writing his first line until she had already written it. She stood there for a moment with both notebooks open, one in each hand, 36 years between them. Then she went back to the step, sat down, and looked at the slope. The October light was doing what October light does, finding every surface and making it specific, making the dark red soil look like it had been waiting all year for exactly this angle. The 12 vines on the south slope stood in it with the stillness of things that have decided where they are and have stopped arguing about it. She closed notebook number 1 carefully and held it in her lap. She picked up the pen. She looked at the blue notebook, at the line she'd written without knowing. She didn't change it. She didn't know she had written the same first line as Everett until she had already written it. She didn't change it. Some things don't need to be different. They just need to continue. Has someone in your life ever prepared something for you? Something you only understood long after they were gone? Tell us where you're watching from. We read every comment.